welcome back to Tech Talks Daily. I'm your host, Neil C. Hughes, and today I've got an intriguing conversation with you because I'm joined by Terry Ray, a significant contributor to data security in the tech world and part of the team behind the extensive 100 Data Breaches Findings report published by cybersecurity leader Imperva. And today, I want to unravel the challenges of securing private data and also dive into the root causes of data breaches and also how they are evolving and the very definition of them are evolving. And we'll do all that while exploring the kinds of data cybercriminals like to attack the most and maybe even uncover the most susceptible industries to these attacks and learn from Terry how to adopt a more proactive than reactive approach to data security strategy. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the US, where we're going to dive deep into the world of data breaches, cybersecurity, and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Thanks, Neil. Yeah, so my name's Terry Ray. I am in America, but at the same time, I travel globally all around the world. I've been doing data security for about 20 years at this point, with the same company, in fact, but dealing primarily with financial services, healthcare, effectively highly regulated businesses, as you might expect, that come to organizations like ours to say, I have private data. Can you help me keep it secure? So as a role, I've held chief technology officer. Today, I spend a lot of my time in the field. So I'm a field technology officer, and I spend a lot of my time focusing on what types of technologies to bring to the market to help organizations solve some of the gaps that they're finding.
And I love the line you used there about clients coming to you and asking you how they can keep private data private. And it sounds such a simple line, but it's getting more and more difficult and challenging as the months and years progress. So one of the reasons that I invited you on the podcast today was I came across Imperva's 100 Data Breaches Findings report. For anyone that's not seen this, can you just give a little overview of what it is, the key objectives of this research, and some of the takeaways from that?
Yeah, sure. So for years and years, decades, I guess at this point, we've had a research and development arm, a pure research arm that really focuses on the threats, the threat actors. There was one in the past about passwords and all kinds of fun things. But this is the output of this research team, just really trying to understand the behavior of organizations, the behavior of threat actors, and whatever happens in between there. And oftentimes, best practice, if you will, both best practice in what not to do, but best practice in what you probably should do. And so some of the findings that we found on here was, number one, the interesting finding for me was when I think about the number of tools, the amount of stuff that organizations have out there trying to solve the problem of data security. And the word data security is such a broad topic. It's like saying network security and lumping everything into it. But trying to solve this data security problem for organizations, what we found by asking these organizations questions, these 100 breaches report, was recognizing that, number one, the more tools that you have, actually as an organization, their response back to us was the more tools they had, especially when they get over 50, they actually felt that they were less capable of detecting and preventing attacks. And this speaks to what we kind of went into. So we looked at everything we could find on the web, everything we could find on any publicly available source on these 100 largest breaches over time. And when we looked at these 100 breaches, the thing to recognize is that there's a lot of information on the web about them, but there's likely just as much information internally that either we don't share, we can't share, more importantly, is never shared. At the same time, while most organizations and most countries at this point have breach notification laws, we recognize that not everybody necessarily notifies on every breach. And at the same time, frankly, most organizations, in fact, don't really know when they're breached. It's not until a bug bounty or someone else comes to them and says, hey, by the way, I happen to have a lot of your data. You've been breached. Now you've formally been notified. Of course, you're going to pay your bounty. You're going to do what you're going to do, but then you deal with all the circumstances from that. So this was research done retroactively on these 100 breaches, trying to pull together whatever statistics, commonalities, themes, if you will, that we could come about. And there's two more items that I would say on here that were not surprising, but somewhat interesting to me. So one was that the capacity of recognizing that half of security professionals that were interviewed, roughly 44% really, but half of security professionals that were interviewed spent 4 hours a day dealing with alerts. Now, that's not surprising. As I said, it's not a surprising thing. It's just interesting and validating that there is a significant amount of overhead in the overall industry of security. And when we think about spending 4 hours a day on data-related incidents, especially for organizations where their SOC, their security operating center, likely, and when I say likely, 99% of them don't have data security expertise, they have to do a lot of work in the back end to try and triage these alerts, because most of the time the alerts they're getting in the data space really don't have the details in the alert itself to triage it. They have to go work cross-functionally throughout the organization. So that investigation is very costly in terms of time and effort on organizations. And the last thing that I'll say here that came from it, while there was a lot of things, was that when we look at the type of data that was breached, if I were to randomly ask a group of 10 people, what do you think is the most breached thing in the world when we think about data, what is stolen? Some of them might say personally identifiable information, PII, and they would be right at roughly 42%. But a lot of them will still say credit cards. A lot of them will still say social security numbers and other things. The reality is that today it is PI, right? PI is 42%. But I think the other piece is how much bigger PI is in terms of its common preponderance of being stolen, if you will, versus the next closest thing. The next closest thing is source code, intellectual property, and then medical information, which has a big overlap with PI, to be fair. But those three are only 5% of those breaches versus 42% of PII. And there's two interesting takeaways from that PI that I deal with every single day, which is number one, a lot of organizations don't consider PI critical data. Now, of course, Europe, GDPR and all this, organizations have said, okay, well, fine, names, addresses, phone numbers, and PI are important to me now. Were they before? No, frankly, they weren't. And in America, there aren't a lot of privacy laws. And even in other countries, while there may be privacy laws, the reality is they don't tend to have teeth. So GDPR kind of sets the example here. So kudos to Europe on having truly a PII-related rule, if you will, to say you need to prioritize this. But the reality is, from an organizational perspective, it's not really considered critical to the function and the business capabilities of that organization. It's only protected because someone else told the organization, you better do this or else. And that's one of the challenges that we see. We still see this data highly targeted, primarily because, yes, it still has gaps, particularly elsewhere around the world, but it also is targeted because, unlike a credit card, unlike even like intellectual property and other things, it has staying power. My name doesn't change. My address hasn't changed in a decade. My phone number hasn't changed in 30 years, right? So my data is a highly monetizable, and it retains its value year after year. So stealing that kind of data truly, benefits an attacker.
And I'm glad you mentioned GDPR there, because when we're talking about businesses not knowing if they've been breached or reporting a breach, considering the hefty GDPR fines now here in Europe are something like 20 million euros or up to 4% of global turnover, whichever is higher. And also, I think, how we define a breach is also evolving. I know this year people in businesses are working quicker by leveraging ChatGPT, but many of them don't think of the dangers of adding company data into a machine learning algorithm. So I'm curious, what were some of the most significant trends and statistics you discovered in this top 100 data breaches over the 12-month period?
Yeah, so there's two ways that I would tackle that, right? So one is, in terms of attacks and trends, I would talk about the root causes. Why are we still seeing breaches? Aren't organizations spending more money? Aren't organizations having more stuff? As I mentioned a minute ago, the more stuff you have doesn't necessarily mean you have more security. It means you have more stuff to manage and you need more expertise. And we can all agree that in cybersecurity, there aren't enough expertise. And so one of the things that we saw here was when we look at the root causes of the data itself, right? So the reality is, as we would all expect, hacking is the most common root cause. It happens all the time. It's about 28% or so. of the breaches that we see out there. So statistically, when we look at those 100, hacking was 28% of what we would see out there. So a good solid, call it roughly a quarter, if that, a little bit more than a quarter of it. But interestingly, hacking can be one of the more difficult things to prevent. It's not that you can't prevent it. It just is easier than another two, I think, are interesting to talk about because they're highly mitigatable. You can really shut them down pretty easily if you just do some basic blocking and tackling when it comes to rudimentary security. And those two add up to actually more total breaches than hacking by itself. So they both have about 14 or so percent of the total breaches, hacking having around technically about 27%. And that's unsecured databases. We see this, I've seen this for year after year, unsecured databases. I don't understand why it still happens. I know why it happens, but I don't understand why we can't get our hands around it. And the second one is around social engineering. Certainly not something new, but social engineering that's out there. So unsecured databases, so easy to talk about, right? So when we think about unsecured databases, recognize most organizations understand how to secure their databases when they're on-prem because they own the perimeter, they own the identity, they own and they deal with this stuff every day. And even though they still have problems with it, the security of the database is built into the software that they're installing. What changes is as we all move to the cloud, we see more and more unsecured databases because each cloud you move into has its own set of configurations, its own set of best practices, and its own level of expertise that are necessary to try and achieve the same thing you've tried to do on-prem to varying degrees of success even on-prem. Now we're trying to do this in an ultra-modern infrastructure in the cloud. And this isn't something new. Of course, this is what we've been dealing with for more than a decade at this point. But still organizations and we find unsecured S3 buckets, unsecured databases, unsecured managed databases, even to the degree that some organizations believe if I put it in the cloud, why is it still my responsibility? Isn't this a managed database? If you look at the fine print, the reality is there are certain roles and responsibilities that your CSP or cloud security provider, cloud service provider will provide you. But the security of the data, the configuration of the roles and the rights and all that kind of stuff, that's on you. That's on the organization itself. And so these are very solvable problems. The social engineering piece is the one that we know we've been dealing with for years and is solvable by recognizing, number one, yes, you have to educate people not to go click that link. Don't click the link in the email. Always look at the email. We understand that because we've all had to go through these little video presentations. But the other piece that an organization can do around social engineering is to recognize that it's not just about people when it comes to the solution. The secondary solution is about least privilege rights. Recognizing that if I have a user that doesn't need to have access to PM, yes, it's easy for me to give that person a generic role that everybody in that department would normally have. But it would be better and more secure if I gave that person a role that provided the rights that person actually needs versus a blanket set of rights. And that same mentality can be applied to applications and to APIs and to every other entity that have access to data, doing a review of exactly what those rights are. These were the findings that I took away from it. There's a lot more inside there, statistics, other kinds of fun things. But my takeaway from this was that hacking definitely is the primary cause. Secondary to that, even easier to fix, or I'd say easy to fix, would be unsecured databases and social engineering. But there's one last thought in terms of what I would say is a takeaway from this. The title itself speaks volumes of it, but it has a gap. 100 data breaches. We all think a data breach, and you mentioned this a second ago, defining a data breach. We all think a data breach is losing data. That's not the definition of a data breach. That's data theft. Data breach is somebody getting in and being able to access my data and do something with it, right? Ransomware is on the list, encrypting my data. I have a couple of, I find interesting stories here, but it's just about manipulating data. There is value in changing data. Sometimes it's personal value, sometimes it's monetary value. So if you'll allow, I've got two real short stories. So one story here is about toll roads. And I use this story all the time because, number one, I was directly related with it, but it's about toll roads. And so it's about being able to recognize the information that flows over toll roads. Now, I assume they work the same way around the world as they do in America, but in America, of course, all toll roads look at our license plate numbers. They can even look at our face. They can count the number of people that are in a car. They can see if there's radioactive material in the car. It can detect all kinds of really interesting things, much of which should only be made available and accessible to law enforcement, the rest of which should be managed by the toll authority or whatever. I've seen cases in the past where DBAs, when the toll authority themselves, of course, have access to that data. They have a role granted them to be able to do whatever they need to with that data, even the data that should only be accessed by law enforcement. And what we found in the past is some of these DBAs, not being bad people, but recognizing they needed to solve a problem, they were tracking their significant other going along the toll road. Their other significant other said, hey, I'm going to the mall today. Well, I can check it and say, did you go to the mall today? Or did you take the toll road to the mall today? It's an inappropriation or a misappropriation of their rights and their roles. And they're not stealing anything, but they are using their privilege in a large violation, I guess, of individual privacy. And the last one I'd say is monetizable. And I saw this one not too long ago. This was about a justice system. And so in the justice system of every country, you have prisons, you have courts and all this sort of thing. Now, the amount of time somebody serves in a prison is stored in a database in a modern country. In some countries, maybe it's stored on paper, but it's stored in a database. Does he have 2 years left, 3 years, 10 years, 15 years, 50 years, whatever it is? Imagine, what would somebody pay to shave a year off of somebody's sentence if a DBA had access to that data? It's not stealing data, but it's monetizing a privilege that DBAs have. Again, DBAs aren't bad people, but they certainly have the keys to the kingdom. And in some cases, it's not even a DBA who has direct access to it. It may be an API or an application that someone's simply manipulating the business logic that exists inside those systems to be able to change some of that sort of thing. So when we think about data security, we think about, yes, we want to prevent people from stealing data. Sure, that's a big part of it. That's what makes the news. These other things, arguably, an organization might say, well, do I need to notify the GDPR Council if nothing was stolen? Do I need to notify my regulatory entity if really somebody just made some money by changing something? I'm going to say it's a gray area. I'm not going to say yes or no. All I'm going to say is that organization and their auditors are going to interpret whether or not that even gets made public. But those are more interesting stories than, I lost another million records. So those are interesting to me. When I hear data breach, I hear data stolen, but I also hear what kind of organization is this and how could you manipulate the data inside that organization for your own gain or for others' gain?
And of course, this is not your first rodeo, and I suspect you've been talking about many of the issues we're talking about here for many years now. But as someone that might think they have seen it all before, I'm curious, was there anything particularly surprising in these findings?
The only thing that was surprising is what I mentioned at the very beginning, really. And that was that organizations themselves recognized that the more tool sets that they had, the less their capability was at detecting and preventing attacks. They fully recognized they needed to minimize the amount of things they have in their environment. Call it consolidation, if you will, but they needed to be able to minimize the amount of effort. Overhead is what I interpreted from this, the amount of effort and overhead it takes for them to monitor, secure, and ultimately detect bad behavior in their environment. And today they're recognizing that they're trying to achieve that same tactic or that same strategy by implementing one tool set, another tool set, another one, and another one. Because what they're finding is there weren't really a lot of tool sets. I don't think this is the case today. I know it's not the case today, but over time, there was a tool set that solves for cloud posture management. There's a tool set that solves for cloud data posture management. There's a tool set that solves for data security in the cloud, and then one for on-prem, and then you get the idea, right? So they needed to be able to have all of these individual pieces of technology, understand all of them and use them all equally well while sending all of that to their SOC. And I think they're recognizing now that that's not necessarily really working for them. And it's not something I don't think they're surprised by it either. They just didn't think in terms of, is there a better way? And when they first implemented those technologies, there may well not have been a better way. I would say like cloud, like data stores and like businesses, security modernizes as well. And I think that was a surprise to me that they recognized that themselves versus someone like me, a vendor, having to try and educate them and say, didn't you know that this is causing you a problem? That was the surprise to me, that they outright said, we recognize this is a problem for us and we need to solve it.
And at the very beginning of our conversation, you were talking about the many different types of data. And again, I'm curious, are there any trends around the types of data that are most commonly targeted by cyber criminals? Are some industries more perceptible or attractive to attackers too, especially around vulnerability and data breaches, etc.? And any trends there?
There are, but they're not necessarily new trends, right? We talked earlier about PI, right? PII, no surprise, right? It's out there. We know people, it's monetizable, so not a surprise on that. What was a surprise was that PCI actually, the statistic was, I think last year, PCI was in the 28% or so range of how much credit card data was stolen. 28% of breaches involved credit cards. In this latest research, when we look across the overall 100 of these altogether, it only accounted for less than 10% of the breaches themselves. It's not that credit cards aren't in demand, and it's not that credit card theft doesn't work and you can't monetize it, but it goes back to the fact that as a hacker, what can I monetize more? PII or PCI or credit cards? Well, frankly, PII is much more monetizable. So if I can get that and that's open, let me go do that. But I think the bigger thing here was that medical information was also pretty low. And I think that's because when we start to think about putting data into buckets, we have to draw the line somewhere, right? So we draw the line on PI, which is traditional PI information. But I can have a medical breach of a hospital and I lose both PI as well as medical information. And that's a medical hospital breach. And that's when we start to talk about the things you mentioned, which is what industries are we focusing on here? Because as I said, I can breach a hospital and I can get credit cards, medical information, PI, intellectual property from research and other things. I can get a whole gambit from a hospital. And so I do tend to talk more along the lines of industry and frankly, less along the lines of specific types of data because it tends to be fairly prolific, the various different types of data in each industry. So for me, the one I see the most common breaches I see out there are in financial services. They're highly targeted, highly monetizable, have all kinds of data. You don't have to attack the attacks don't have to be on the largest financial services in the world who spend millions upon millions and millions of dollars on security every year. A credit card, a piece of PI from a smaller institution spins and works and is just as monetizable as a larger institution. So the feedback here that I get and the takeaway that I take from this is regardless of what size you are, if you're in the business of FSI, financial services and insurance, recognize that you are absolutely one of the most targeted industries in the world. And that's not a surprise to anybody. I speak at financial services in industry events all the time. They're keenly aware of it. And we have a large practice right now around healthcare, a large project around healthcare. Healthcare is one that certainly organizations in healthcare recognize that they are targeted. They just have a very unique challenge in that margins are very tight in that business. Many of them are actually nonprofits anyway. And so when we start to look at the amount of spend that healthcare has available to them in the security space, as compared, say, to financial services, where it behooves them to secure their data because I can swap a bank pretty easy, I'm not likely to swap my hospital because of a breach or my doctor because of a breach. So there's some stickiness there to their clientele, if you will, but they still want to be able to secure that data. Healthcare organizations literally can be shut down by different types of attacks, losing access to their data. My wife is a surgeon, by the way. So losing access to data means that you're canceling surgeries, you're pushing surgeries out. That not only has monetary implication to the health organization itself, of course, it has health implications to the person whose surgery is being pushed out that can have impact there. So financial services, FSI, healthcare, for sure, top of the list. But I'll add one more to it. And it's not necessarily in this report, but it is from experience. Education and even government fall actually at the bottom of the list in terms of their capacity to actually provide security. They are highly targeted because of that reason. The education tends to have a little bit less private data than government, but I've talked to government agencies before, and in some cases they'll say, look, we know we're getting attacked all the time. Not really a big problem for us, to be honest. I mean, we don't have a lot for them to steal. We don't take credit cards. We don't have this. You can monetize some private data, but we don't need to adhere to the same regulations that we make in some cases. So, they spend a lot of money. There's no question about that, but they lose a lot of their skill set in a lot of cases. So they wind up having a lot of breaches. They wind up having a lot of breaches that you don't hear about because they don't fall into the same breach notification laws in many cases that you might have as a private organization.
So based on your research, are there any common tactics or strategies used by some of these bad actors that breach organizations' data? And how can organizations essentially effectively defend against these threats? Is there anything that they should be looking out for?
Yeah, no, I definitely don't want to imply that, gosh, people, there's just nothing you can do. You can't. Yeah. You're just going to deal with it, right? So, I mean, the way I would say it would be, there are common oversights that organizations implement or don't implement and ultimately enable data breaches. So you don't want to enable the hacker, if you will, right? So some of the basics are you don't have multi-factor authentication, right? We want to know if it's an employee. We want to know if it's Terry logging in. This is basic blocking and tackling. So you need to make sure you have multi-factor authentication for at least your own employees and the people that have access to your most critical data. And let's remember, your most critical data is not what you as the organization think is critical. It's what a hacker would think is critical and what could monetize. You may not think my name is very critical to you, but I think my name is pretty critical and a hacker can monetize my name. So please protect it. Same thing is true about a password policy, making certain you have password policies. So these two are always at the top of the list. We always assume organizations do a great job with MFA and password policies, but they don't. Then we get into the really data-specific stuff, and there's 4 of them. One is about misconfiguration, right? Misconfigured data infrastructures, as we talked about earlier, unsecured databases. Unsecured databases are responsible for 14% of all data breaches in those 100. So 14% of them are simply unsecured data stores. So let's fix that. Misconfigured data infrastructures out there have to be corrected. There are tools that you can either apply to it or expertise you can hire to do it. The last 3 all go hand in hand, and they're, in my opinion, the most critical to do. They're the biggest gap that organizations, small and large, still have today. Organizations still have limited visibility to activity monitoring of all data assets. And I say it that way on purpose. They have limited visibility of activity monitoring of all, stressing and bolding and underlying all data assets. You need to be able to do the same thing in your data space that you do today with all of your endpoints and all of your networks. There's not a network segment that doesn't have a firewall or something else that's monitoring what's happening on that network segment. We don't just say we're just going to monitor our important network segment and ignore all the traffic on the others. And we don't do that on our endpoints. Our endpoints all have some kind of an agent, anti-malware, antivirus, whatever it is on them, because we know all they have to do is click a link and they've got a problem. So we cover all of those. Yet we do something completely different in the data space. And we say, well, I really probably only need to look at the data stores, databases, file servers that have private data. I don't need to look at anything else because why would I? Nothing can happen anything else. Why do I care? Just like a network, just like an endpoint, all it takes is one hole for me to get a foothold. And from there, I spread like fruit flies in your house. By the way, I have fruit flies in my house. I'm dealing with them right now. So that's what it is. It just takes one piece of rotten fruit, and it doesn't have to be the fruit that you like or is important to you. It just takes one, and you've got a problem. That leads to limited vulnerability protection. What it means is if all I have monitoring are the 2 databases, one that has PI and one that has PCI, if I have a SIM or analytics or tools like Imperva or whatever, if all I'm feeding them is a small little trickle of data and I expect them to learn something important from that small trickle of data, I'm kidding myself. It just doesn't work that way. I have to, if I want to use modern threat detection tools that leverage machine learning and advanced technologies, I have to feed them something to learn from. I have to look at everything so I can do comparisons and peer comparisons and all of these things. I have to feed it a lot of data. And the last thing that I will say, and this is, I've seen this so many times, is not learning from past data breaches. I've had organizations be breached. Pick up the phone, call us and say, I've been breached. I know exactly where the breach was, and I want to secure that asset. And we will say, do you not want to secure everything? You just want to secure that one? I just want to secure that one. That's all I want to do. I'm like, do you want to block on that asset? No, I don't want to block on the asset. I just want to know if it happens again. I'm like, so what are we solving for here? You just want us to tell you the next time this happens. Yep, that's all I want. This is the problem. We don't do this. Nobody does this if the rest of their security. This is only done in data security. And the reason they want to solve for that is because they want to know about it so that they can do a breach notification and they can be aware of it, but they just don't want to solve the problem of data security by really doing the same things they've been doing on all the rest of their practice in the data space. And that's a big challenge for organizations. But the reality is those are the 6 most common things that I see and that I take away from those 100 that organizations routinely do that we saw they didn't have these types of services in place. And it led to the gaps that we see in those 100 data breaches.
And I suspect there'll be people nodding in agreement all around the world. Your words will resonate with them so much there. And I think that balance between a proactive and reactive approach is possibly the biggest challenge of all. And as Imperva's SVP and field CTO, I've got to ask you, are there any other recommendations that you have for a business leader or organization that could be listening to build their own robust data security strategy? Avoid becoming one of those soft targets for cyber criminals that are just looking to exploit their vulnerabilities. Is there any big takeaways that you would leave anyone listening?
Yeah, certainly I could sit here and talk for another 8 hours, yeah. Right? If there was one thing I would say as an organization you truly decided to do, that the most extensible thing that you could have that would solve or help solve for so many other pieces would be, let's start looking at absolutely all activity, just like my network firewall does, just like every single endpoint piece of software does. Do the same thing in your data. Do not believe that by just monitoring what you have to, because your regulatory auditor said go monitor that server, that you have a data security strategy. Monitoring one or a handful of your servers that have the critical data on them is not a strategy. That is a tactic to be compliant. And that is completely okay if that is your goal. If your goal is to be compliant, then kudos, you're doing it. But do not be surprised when you have a breach and the auditor, the law enforcement agency, whoever it is, comes to you and says, what was taken? And your answer is, I have no idea what was taken. I don't know where it was taken from. It could have been any one of 10 or 15 different places, because this is not regulated data for me, or it's regulated data and I just didn't know I had it over there at all. And I wasn't monitoring that, so I didn't look at it. That will get you into a very hefty fine and a lot of stuff, at least in America. I can't speak for every country. But if nothing else, you won't be able to close a hole. And I would hope if you can't close a hole from a security perspective, that would keep you up at night, knowing that somebody took all of your data and you don't know where they got it. I haven't found where my fruit flies are coming from yet, and it's driving me nuts. So I would think this would be the same thing here. If you can't answer, what did Terry do to my data in every single data store across your enterprise, you have massive gaps in your data security strategy. And if that's important to you, that's the first thing you need to solve for above all else.
Fantastic. I love chatting with you today. I've got to ask for yourself, though. What's next for you? Is there anything you can share around your big focus for the rest of the year?
Yeah. So one of the things we found from organizations that we work with is, okay, they've agreed, we need to solve this data security problem. But their next step, once they say, okay, now I'm seeing everything, now I have visibility, Terry, can you help me understand what my risk is? Can you apply what I'm doing in my infrastructure and give me a score, put a number to it, give me a rating? What's my NPI? We're not using NPI, but what's my score in terms of risk? How can I compare myself to my peers? Am I doing better or worse than my closest competitor or whoever it is in my country or in my industry? And so I'm putting a lot of focus right now on being able to have the algorithms, being able to put the information together. What are those things that go together to create data security risk? And how do you build a score around that? So an organization can say, yesterday I had a few holes. I did a little work yesterday, and today my score got better. And tomorrow it's getting better. And I can feed that directly to my executives and say, this is what we've done this year, and we have improved. Or, we acquired a company mid-year and it tanked our risk score because we didn't do due diligence, and they've got all kinds of gaps. And so I need appropriate funding to bring them in line with where our normal risk, where we're used to having a risk score around the organization. That technology doesn't really exist today. And that's what I'm spending a lot of my time for in closing that gap, hopefully here by the end of the year.
Fantastic. We've talked about some very serious and important topics today. But before we started recording, we also talked about summer vacation time. I know you've got a few long flights on the horizon. So I'm going to ask you now, can you leave everyone listening with a book that means something to you? Maybe a holiday read, maybe something else, or a song that means something to you. And we'll get whatever you choose added to our Spotify playlist or Amazon wishlist. But all I'm going to ask before I let you go is, what would you like to leave everyone listening with, and why?
Yeah, so for me, I watched the movie now for the second time, and I had a CEO that kept talking about changing the game, and he was a very analytic-focused CEO. And so I'll leave you with a book, right? So if you haven't read it, it's a very popular book, bestseller, so I know a lot of people probably read it, but it's Moneyball. It's about the Oakland Athletics, and it's about truly changing how recruiting occurs in baseball. And to be fair, I don't even like baseball, but just understanding how important statistics are, how important information is. This book really resonates with me because everything, and it's not just because what we talked about today, but it's what I talk about every single day, is about, I can't do the job of data security if I don't have information, if I don't have quality information. And that's exactly, to me, what this book is about, truly drilling down into what's important and distilling that down into actionable evidence so that you can go and make a decision. In their case, it's making a decision for, I don't want to run the book, but making decisions. In data security, it's about making decisions on, should I block something or shouldn't I? And that can be very important in some of these industries as to whether you want to make that decision or not.
Wow, what a great book. I'll get that added to our Amazon wish list. And for anyone listening wanting to delve a little bit deeper into some of the stuff we've been talking about today, we've referenced that report. Maybe they want to look at that. Maybe they want to talk to a member of your team or just find out more information. What's the best starting point for everything?
It's always Imperva.com, IMPERVA.com. I'm certainly on LinkedIn, as many of us are, and I certainly link to whoever comes to me. Happy to chat, but Imperva.com is the best way to get a hold of us.
Well, a huge thank you for sitting down, talking about some very important topics, discussing some of the numbers that Imperva found in that 100 data breaches findings report. I'll add a link to that as well so people can find that nice and easy. But on top of that, you even had time to leave us with a great book. But more than anything, just thank you for sitting down and sharing your insights today.
Thank you. Appreciate your time, as always. Thanks, Neil.
A huge thank you to Terry for joining us on the podcast today. And I, for one, learned about the intricate challenges of data security, the root causes of breaches, the most vulnerable industries, and, of course, how even the definition is evolving continuously. So I think we were enlightened today on the common oversight and the criticality of a comprehensive data security strategy. Because in today's digital age, staying secure is not an option, it's a necessity. So a big thank you to Terry for coming on and also telling us about Imperva, how they're protecting companies at all stages of that digital journey, and the importance of a robust threat research and global intelligence community and the role that plays in allowing them to stay ahead in the threat landscape, to provide the latest security, privacy, compliance expertise, seamlessly integrated into their solutions. So a big thank you to Terry for joining us on the podcast today. And even bigger thank you to each and every one of you for tuning in. Don't forget, subscribe, stay updated with more enlightening tech conversations like this. And as always, if you've got any questions, anything you want to add to the conversation, email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, or get me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, wherever you want to hang out. Just look for @NeilC.Hughes. But hey, stay safe, stay informed, keep innovating. Big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.